Hello, average looking souls. It's me, Russ Rapp, coming to you live, here and now, in this moment that doesn't exist. So, as you probably guessed, we're going to be talking about non-duality. So, if you have any comments or questions, feel free to live chat it here, and I'll try to get to it. And in this talk, I want to mention a few things, ideas that I've been considering recently. One has to do with the heart, and the other has to do with being discontented with how life is, and how do you square that away with what non-duality teaches. So, but before I get into that, I just wanted to mention I was watching some other videos on non-duality, and one of the comments I had seen is the person was wondering, why don't we call it something different other than non-duality, whether it's oneness or unity or something like that. And I've mentioned this in a few of my other videos, but I think the reason why we talk about it in the term or the concept of non-duality is because when you think of the idea of oneness, it makes you feel like there's something that exists. And so if you're a person that feels disconnected from oneness, or you're mad at the world, or you have struggles in your relationships, then the idea of everything's one and we are a part of this oneness, this ocean, we're just a vast drop, makes it seem like, well, I feel like I'm not a part of that. And so non-duality is kind of saying oneness in a different way. And it's pointing to the idea of negation, of saying not to, because in the concept itself, and non-duality is just a concept in the sense that this is how we communicate as human beings. But non-duality is what is. But as in the context of the idea that there's not two, it implies a oneness. But in that word, that phrase itself, it says, hey, there is a not two. So there's there's a seeming self and other. There's a seeming separation, and it's pointing to that recognition, because it's easy to forget when you have a new idea or a new epiphany to grab onto that as just another attached idea that isn't really what non-duality is saying. And so non-duality, in a sense, is more kind of a verb pointing to the fact that you believe something that's not true in the ultimate sense. But let's talk about the heart. My heart, your heart, human heart, any sort of heart. The thing in your chest that pumps blood throughout your body consistently. Because I was lying in bed here this week, a few different nights, and just listening to the sound of my heart beating, and just realizing it's just this giant muscle that's pumping blood constantly. And it kind of got me thinking in regards to how we see non-duality, and how we see ourselves as separate individuals. A lot of that is centered right here, right in the skull area. We call it a brain. So you have this brain, and that's what we, and partly because we have our eyes centered in that, in our ears. So a lot of our kind of higher level senses, if you will, are in that general area. But most of us feel like our identity, our self, is stored in the brain. And partly because you can get a heart transplant, get a new heart, which is an amazing feat of medicine. And when your heart leaves your body as the separate self, it no longer identifies that as you. And it's the same thing as if you got your finger cut off, or you lost an arm, or any sort of appendage. You can get by with missing a finger, and at that point, once it's severed, the nerve endings are severed. It no longer seems to be you anymore. Just a bunch of dying cells that'll end up rotting. Unless you freeze it, I guess you can save it for later. So, but the difference with the heart is you can't live without a heart. And so you can lose a finger and get rid of it, it's no longer you, but the heart has to be replaced with another heart, or some sort of machine that at least can, pump your blood. And so as far as like an essential part of your existence, your heart is just as crucial to you as a living separate entity as your brain. And yet most often we think of identity, self, ego as stemming from the brain. And I did a little Wikipedia research, and thus far there's been no brain transplants successfully, because your body rejects, your immune system goes and attacks your brain, essentially, is a major problem with that whole thing. Which I think is interesting, because as we identify as a separate self, because we talk about non-duality, but how do you point towards non-duality? Is by pointing out the duality that you're tied to, that you're connected with, that you're attached to. And so if you talk about your separate self having a heart and a brain, it feeds in this idea that you are somehow, so let me say it like this. So you have all these different organs in your body, which are made up of cells, and yet we typically identify with the mental process, the identity, the physical body that has mental processes, thoughts, ideas, feelings. And that's what we identify with as human beings. But oftentimes we don't identify with the individual pieces that make up this whole being, body, mind, if you want to call it that. It's probably the easiest way to say it. The body mind that we see as ourselves. We don't look at the different parts as us. And so we lose skin cells all the time that die off. We don't, throw a funeral for every night because of all the dead skin cells. Our cells within our body are constantly changing, dying, growing. And so I can't remember exactly. I think your spinal cord probably lasts the longest, your brain, but most of your cells rejuvenate and are not the same as when you were younger, let's say. And so we don't necessarily see those cells as ourselves. And bringing it back to the heart, we don't necessarily always think of the heart as ourselves. We don't consciously pay attention to the beating that happens. It's in the subconscious, essentially. It's below our conscious awareness of this beating heart, and so we're not identified with it. But without that heart, that's a part of you as a living person, you would be dead. But we don't sit and have to constantly think, oh, I gotta pump my heart, It just happens naturally, happens on its own. And so even though it's a part of who we are as a separate living individual, we don't identify with that. So the identification that we're talking about oftentimes with non-duality is kind of that part that comes from the neocortex, that thing that says, hey, I think, therefore I am separate, I am alive, I am doing this or that. And that's where we see that being an issue, and we see that, because the more aware of you as a separate self, as being alive, the more you become attached to that, and so it's kind of a reinforcing cycle. So, with that being said, the other thing I wanted to mention or talk about tonight was this idea of, and it's not something I've thought about recently, but it kind of, I guess, popped in my head this morning. In regards to non-duality, I think a lot of times people struggle with the concept of non-duality, or the reality of non-duality, because they see certain aspects of their life that they aren't happy with, that they want to change. And so when you hear the message of non-duality, you hear the idea that, everything what is, everything, there is no person, there is no self, whatever the, if you watch enough non-dual videos, a lot of this becomes cliche as far as that goes, which is fine, because I think your brain constantly forgets, constantly has to be reminded. It's kind of like advertising. You have to be told 7 times, and there's no, to be told 3 times in 7 days for it to really start sinking in on a long-term basis. But the more and more you hear this message, that's why if you watch speakers like Tony Parsons, it's just kind of the same thing over and over again, and people still come to it with more questions, even though it's kind of the same approach, saying the same message in a slightly different way. But when it comes to this idea of being, yes, I agree, Chase, Paul Hederman is the GOAT. Yeah, I definitely like, just kidding, that's you. Yeah, no, I really like Paul Hederman. It's always interesting to hear him talk, even though he says kind of along the same lines. He says some of the same stories, but he always says them in a slightly different way, and it's kind of just like, I think his approach and the way he presents it, I think, is key. And anytime you're talking, like, he talks a lot about addiction, and I think that's the same thing with the brain, wanting, your brain wanting the same thing, wanting to get that next hit, if you will, and always seeking for the next thing that's going to get you by. I think with addiction, the brain is trained to think in a repetitive way. And so when you talk about non-duality, a lot of speakers say the same things over and over again, because it's in that repetition that eventually I think you get tired of it. I think it's maybe what appears to happen is you get tired of it. And so then it finally sinks in, like, oh, okay. I finally get where he's coming from. But, I think when it comes to non-duality and feeling like there's aspects of your life that you want to change, that doesn't seem to jive all the time, as far as if everything is as it should be, or as it is, how do I change my life? How, if I believe this concept of non-duality, that we're all one essentially, or we're not two, then what's the point of anything? You kind of lose that sense of meaning or purpose. And so, like, well, but there's parts of my life that I want to change, and so what do I do with that? And so that's kind of the dilemma I think a lot of people fall into when it comes to non-duality. And I guess my take on it is, I think the message of non-duality is pointing to the idea that all of that is a story. And I think it loosens up I think as Paul Hederman would say, you end up traveling lighter. And I'm not saying there's some moment of where you reach the pinnacle and all of a sudden now your life is seemingly perfect. But I think what happens is the message of non-duality is saying that the idea that you have to change something, the idea that something is a habit, is going to continue on in the future, is just an illusion. It's not. It's just a story, however you want to say it. And so in those moments where you're in a situation that you're not accepting, non-duality would say everything is accepting. Everything is accepting of what is. And so that's not to say that what is in this apparent moment is going to be there forever. It's kind of saying the opposite, that what you're experiencing in this moment isn't real in the sense that it won't be there in the next moment. It's just a temporary situation. And so the assumption as a human being, since obviously just the sensation and perception that we see is always kind of a continual process, that we see things in a habitual manner, like nothing, like right now I'm sitting here talking to a laptop, and in the next moment it's going to be the same basic situation, just slightly different. And so it's easy to see from the storyline that it continues. But non-duality is basically saying that it's the story itself that has no basis, has no grounding. And so when you're concerned about whether or not you're going to kick the drinking habit, or whether or not you're going to stop having OCD, or whether or not you're going to do better at working out, or whatever, or you want to make more money, whatever that for you is in the moment, it doesn't really matter in the context of non-duality, because maybe you will continue to drink, maybe you won't. But the freedom of non-duality is the acknowledgement that everything is how it is. So maybe the story will play out like you think it will, or maybe it won't. But I think it loosens up you as a separate self to consider all possibilities, because everything's possible to no one. I did have another thought, but I'll probably save that to the next time. But it's kind of goes along the lines of the joke where a priest, a pastor, and a minister, three guys walk into a bar, kind of a thing. But I'll have to figure that one out before next time. So I guess I got nothing, unless you have any questions before I go. So is my, what's this? Is that a microphone? Not sure. I'm assuming my volume is fine. Okay. The other thing that's great about non-duality is you can just not talk and it doesn't change anything. I think what a lot of speakers do is they stare into the camera for a long period of time. What I want to do is have that's a secret. But a lot of times, if you get credibility as a speaker, or someone that talks about non-duality, I think or like with anything in life, if you have a certain number of people that follow you, or if you speak towards, in front of large groups. But when it comes to non-duality, the only credibility that you need is that you are this. That's all you need. So, all right. Have a good night. Peace.